I never expected the night my husband humiliated me in public to become the night the entire city discovered who I really was. For 3.5 years, I had been married to Victor Hale. To the outside world, Victor was brilliant, charismatic, influential. He was the founder and face of one of the most prestigious nonprofit foundations in the city, an organization that hosted lavish charity galas attended by politicians, CEOs, and donors who wrote 6-figure checks while posing for photographs under crystal chandeliers. Victor lived for those nights. The attention, the applause, the way people leaned closer when he spoke. But if you had asked anyone at those events who I was, most of them wouldn't have known, and that wasn't an accident. That was exactly how my husband preferred it. The moment everything changed happened at Victor's Foundation's annual charity gala at the Grand Metropolitan Ballroom, a black tie event. Hundreds of guests, reporters from half the business magazines in the country. The kind of evening where reputations were built and destroyed between champagne toasts. Victor had spent 8 months planning that gala. Every flower arrangement, every seating chart, every donor plaque engraved with names large enough to flatter the ego of whoever paid for it. That night, he was glowing with pride, and I stood beside him near the coat check area, holding his designer briefcase while guests arrived. Invisible, exactly where he liked me. When Victor introduced me to the chairman of his board of directors, I expected the usual polite acknowledgement. Maybe a quick smile. Maybe even a quiet mention that I was his wife. Instead, Victor laughed, a light, dismissive laugh that made several people nearby turn their heads. "Oh," he said casually, waving his hand toward me as if I were part of the furniture. "That's just my assistant. Don't worry about her." The chairman chuckled politely. Victor leaned closer to him and added with a grin, "She's harmless." Then he walked away in his expensive Italian shoes without even looking back. And just like that, I was left standing there, holding his bag, ignored, exactly as I had been trained to be over the years. Victor hadn't married me because of my accomplishments. He hadn't married me because of my mind. He married me because I allowed him to believe I had none. For years, I had let him build that illusion, because sometimes silence is the most powerful disguise a person can wear. But that night, the illusion shattered. Because the keynote speaker of Victor's gala was a man named Trevor Walsh, a billionaire tech founder, a man Victor had spent months bragging about meeting and impressing, a man he claimed admired his leadership and philanthropic vision. Victor had no idea that Trevor Walsh and I had a history that went back more than a decade, a history that would turn that elegant ballroom upside down in less than 5 minutes. Halfway through Trevor's speech, his eyes moved across the room, and then he saw me. His entire expression changed. His prepared speech slipped from his hands. The room went silent. And the next words Trevor Walsh spoke would destroy everything my husband had spent years building. Because he pointed across the ballroom directly at me and said, "I can't continue this speech without acknowledging the woman who made my entire career possible." Suddenly, hundreds of heads turned in my direction. And for the first time that entire night, I was no longer invisible. I was the center of the room, and my husband, who had just introduced me as his assistant, was staring at me like he had never seen me before in his life. Before that night, before the whispers and the headlines and the stunned expressions frozen across a ballroom full of powerful people, my life with Victor Hale looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. If someone had described our marriage in a magazine profile, it would have sounded elegant and balanced. Victor Hale, visionary founder of a high-profile philanthropic foundation. Sophia Rivers, his quiet, supportive wife. The kind of woman who smiled politely in photographs and stood slightly behind her husband during speeches. That image was exactly what Victor wanted. And for years, I allowed it. I'm 39 years old. Long before I became Victor Hale's invisible wife, I had built my own career in the technology world. Not the glamorous version people like to imagine. Not the kind that comes with magazine covers and conference spotlights. My work happened behind the scenes. Strategic investments, infrastructure decisions, quiet advisory roles that determined whether startups survived their first 3 years or collapsed under their own ambition. I had stepped away from the public side of that world almost a decade earlier. That decision had been deliberate. After spending nearly 15 years navigating venture capital rooms filled with egos and power struggles, I realized something important. The people with the most influence were rarely the ones speaking the loudest. Real power preferred silence. So I stepped back, sold a portion of my holdings, moved my assets into private investment structures that didn't carry my name, and disappeared from the public narrative of the tech industry. Most people assumed I had simply retired early. That was convenient. Victor met me 2 years after that decision. We met at a small wine bar near the lake house where I had been living quietly. He was charismatic from the very beginning, the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly start 3 conversations without even trying. Victor had just begun launching his nonprofit foundation at the time. He spoke passionately about social impact, about changing systems, about creating a network of wealthy donors who could do good while building influence. His energy was contagious. And I'll admit something honestly now that I didn't fully understand back then. Victor didn't fall in love with who I was. He fell in love with who he believed I was. A quiet woman, comfortable staying in the background, someone who admired his ambition, someone who would never compete with him for attention. During our early dates, Victor talked endlessly about his plans, the foundation, the galas, the partnerships with corporations and political leaders. He described a future where his name would become synonymous with philanthropy in our city. When he asked about my past, I kept my answers simple. I used to work in technology investments. That was the sentence I always used. Technically true, but intentionally vague. Victor never asked deeper questions. Not once. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. When a person truly loves you, curiosity comes naturally. Victor didn't want to know more, because the version of me he imagined fit perfectly into the life he wanted to build. We married 2 years later. The wedding was beautiful, elegant, full of the same donors and social elites who would later attend his charity galas. But even during those early years of marriage, something subtle began happening. At Victor's events, introductions slowly changed. At first he said, "This is my wife, Sophia." Then eventually it became, "This is Sophia." And later, "This is someone who helps me with logistics sometimes." Small changes, tiny dismissals, each one easy to overlook in isolation. But over time, they formed a pattern. At galas and fundraisers, Victor often handed me small tasks. "Can you hold this for a second? Would you mind grabbing my phone from the table? Could you stand over there until I finish talking with them?" And every time I complied quietly. Part of me was studying him, studying the social world he had built around himself, the donors who flattered him, the journalists who repeated his narratives without checking them, the board members who praised his leadership while quietly ignoring inconsistencies in the foundation's finances. Victor loved admiration. He thrived on it. And he surrounded himself with people who reinforced the image he wanted the world to see. Over time, he began telling stories that were embellished, then exaggerated, eventually completely fabricated. One of his favorite stories involved a famous tech entrepreneur, a man Victor claimed to have met at a ski resort in Aspen. According to Victor's version, the two of them had spent hours discussing innovation and business philosophy over coffee. Victor loved repeating the story, especially when donors asked about his connections to the technology world. The entrepreneur's name was Trevor Walsh. Victor spoke about Trevor like they were colleagues, friends even. He claimed Trevor admired his leadership, that Trevor had once told him his mind was wasted in philanthropy. But I knew the truth, because the Aspen trip had happened. Victor and I had gone together, and Victor had spent most of that trip lying in our hotel room with severe altitude sickness. He barely left the bed for 3 days. The closest he came to meeting Trevor Walsh was sharing an elevator with someone who might have been him. Victor didn't even recognize him at the time. Yet somehow, months later, the story had transformed into a professional friendship. Victor told that story at every gala, every donor dinner, every board meeting, and no one questioned it. Because in rooms like those, people prefer impressive stories over inconvenient truths. What Victor didn't know, what he never bothered to ask, was that Trevor Walsh and I had known each other for more than 12 years, long before his company existed, long before his name appeared in magazines, before anyone called him a visionary. I had met Trevor when he was a desperate 26-year-old with exactly $27 in his bank account and a business idea that most investors thought was ridiculous. But I saw something different. I saw potential. And the decision I made that day would quietly shape the next decade of Trevor's life and mine. Victor never asked about that part of my past because he never imagined it existed, which is why, on the night of his gala, when Trevor Walsh looked across that ballroom and recognized me, everything Victor believed about his own life collapsed in a single moment. The truth is, humiliation rarely begins with one catastrophic moment. It begins with repetition, with little cuts, with patterns so subtle you keep telling yourself they don't matter, until one day you realize you've been bleeding for years. That was what life with Victor had become. Not openly cruel, not dramatic in the beginning, worse than that. Refined, polished, socially acceptable, the kind of disrespect that hides behind charm and perfect tailoring. In private, Victor could still be attentive when it served him. He knew how to ask about my day while checking emails at the same time. He knew how to place a hand lightly on my back in public, making himself look like a devoted husband, while quietly steering me out of conversations he didn't want me included in. He knew how to kiss my cheek in front of donors and then speak over me the moment I opened my mouth. At first, I excused it. He's stressed. He's building something. He doesn't mean it that way. That is the dangerous thing about loving someone who diminishes you gently. You keep mistaking erosion for compromise. There were nights after his events when we would drive home in silence, the city lights sliding across the windshield, and I would replay some small moment in my head. The way he had introduced me vaguely to a donor couple from Boston. The way he had interrupted me when I mentioned I used to work in venture strategy. The way he laughed and said, "Sophia likes to make my world sound more interesting than it is." I remember one dinner in particular, about a year before the gala. We were seated with 2 corporate sponsors and a woman from a national arts board. The conversation turned to early-stage investments and market volatility. One of the sponsors mentioned a failed acquisition, and before I could stop myself, I asked a simple question about their debt structure. He blinked, then stared at me. "That's actually a very sharp question," he said. I saw it happen instantly, the slight tightening in Victor's jaw, the way his smile changed. He put down his fork, laughed softly, and said, "Sophia reads a lot. She picks up terminology and surprises people." The sponsor smiled politely. I smiled too. But under the table, my fingers pressed so tightly into my palm that crescent marks stayed there for an hour. That was Victor's real talent. He never had to openly insult me. He simply translated me into something smaller, again and again. Over time, even his staff began to take their cue from him. His assistant, Lauren, had a habit of addressing me with excessive sweetness, the kind that wasn't respect, but hierarchy disguised as politeness. "Do you mind carrying this folder for Victor? Could you check whether his car is ready? Can you wait over there in case he needs anything?" Not because she believed I worked for him, because Victor had trained everyone around him to interact with me that way. And I let it happen. That part matters, because silence can be strategy, but it can also become habit. I told myself I was preserving peace. I told myself I didn't care about rooms full of shallow people and rehearsed smiles. I told myself Victor's need for performance said more about him than it did about me. All of that was true, but another truth sat underneath it, quieter and harder to admit. Some part of me had begun adjusting to being unseen. Victor's family only deepened that pattern. His mother, Eleanor Hale, was the sort of woman who could say cruel things in a tone so elegant, people mistook them for manners. At family dinners, she often praised Victor in long, glowing speeches about his intelligence, his social instincts, his generosity, his future. Then she would turn to me with a smile and ask questions that sounded harmless until you listened closely. "And how do you keep busy these days, Sophia? You must love having such a calm life." It's wonderful that Victor has a wife who doesn't need the spotlight. Every sentence had the same message hidden inside it. You are decorative. You are secondary. You are fortunate to be here. Victor never corrected her, not once. If anything, he seemed relieved by how neatly she reinforced the role he had already assigned me. His sister, Celeste, was less polished and more direct. She once looked around our dining room during a holiday lunch and said, "Victor always did need someone peaceful. A woman with too much ambition would have made marriage impossible for him." Then she laughed as if she had made some charming observation. Victor laughed too. I remember lifting my wine glass so they wouldn't see the change in my expression. Those were the moments that stayed with me later. Not the big public humiliations, the smaller ones. The ones that told me over and over exactly what kind of wife I was expected to be. By the 3rd year of our marriage, Victor had become obsessed with social positioning in a way that felt almost feverish. Every gala had to be bigger than the last. Every guest list had to signal more power. Every story had to place him one step closer to people with real influence. That was when Trevor Walsh's name began appearing constantly in our house. At breakfast, in the car, during fittings for tuxedos and event rehearsals. Victor spoke about him with an enthusiasm that bordered on worship. Trevor understands scale. Trevor knows how to command investor confidence. Trevor respects people with vision. The irony almost amused me at first. Then it became exhausting. Victor was building an entire social fantasy around a man he had never actually met. One evening, about 3 weeks before the gala, I found him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, rehearsing an anecdote. He didn't know I was there. He was adjusting his cufflinks and smiling at his own reflection as he said, "Trevor and I were talking in Aspen about how legacy matters more than valuation." Then he paused and repeated it, this time with a warmer laugh, more intimate, more believable. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, watching him perform a friendship that had never existed. When he finally noticed me, he startled and frowned. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," I said. Victor exhaled sharply and straightened his jacket. "You know how these events work, Sophia. People connect through stories." "Stories," I repeated. He held my gaze for a second too long. Then he said, "Not everything has to be dissected." That sentence sat between us all night. Because what he meant was simple. Truth was inconvenient. Optics were useful, and he preferred usefulness. As the gala drew closer, the atmosphere in our house changed. Victor became restless, more controlling. He snapped at caterers over speakerphone, rewrote seating plans after midnight, changed floral designers twice, ordered imported wine because the original selection didn't communicate enough distinction. And with each new pressure, he pushed me further into the background. On the morning of the gala, he walked through the foyer while I was reading near the window and dropped a garment bag across the chair in front of me. "Wear the navy dress tonight," he said. I looked up. "I was planning to." "Good. It's understated." I said nothing. He checked his watch, then added, "Also, stay near coat check when guests first arrive. There'll be too much movement around the entrance, and I don't need confusion." I studied his face. The casual certainty, the assumption that I would obey. "And what exactly am I there for?" I asked quietly. Victor looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "To help," he said. "Don't make this difficult, Sophia. Tonight matters." Tonight matters. Not we matter. Not this matters to both of us. Just him. Just the performance. I nodded because I had not yet decided what that night was going to become. But something in me had already started shifting. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make the old silence feel different in my own chest. By the time we arrived at the Grand Metropolitan Ballroom that evening, I could already feel it. That pressure in the air that comes before a storm. When everything still looks elegant on the surface, but the atmosphere has changed. Victor was radiant, perfectly dressed, confident, moving from guest to guest with the polished ease of a man who believed the room belonged to him. And I stood where he had placed me, near the coat check, holding his designer briefcase and watching the life he had built out of appearances, watching the lie swell to its fullest size, watching 1,000 tiny dismissals gather themselves into one final, irreversible moment. I didn't know exactly how the night would break, but I knew, with a certainty so deep it felt physical, that something was about to end. The Grand Metropolitan Ballroom looked exactly the way Victor had dreamed it would. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light across marble floors, polished to the point where reflections looked almost unreal. Round tables were arranged with mathematical precision beneath towering arrangements of white orchids. Silver place cards gleamed under candlelight, each one carefully positioned to signal importance. Power had its own seating chart, and Victor had memorized every inch of it. When we arrived, he immediately transformed into the version of himself he loved most, the public one. His shoulders squared, his smile widened, and his voice slipped into the smooth tone he used when speaking to donors and reporters. I walked beside him through the entrance. For a moment, several guests glanced at me curiously. Then Victor gently guided me away from the center of the room toward the coat check area, exactly as he had instructed earlier. "Just stay here until things settle down," he said quietly. "Victor," I began, but he had already spotted someone important approaching. A man in his 60s with a silver watch that probably cost more than most people's cars, Victor's board chairman. Victor's entire posture changed instantly. He stepped forward eagerly, shaking the man's hand with enthusiastic warmth. "Charles, I'm so glad you made it." The chairman smiled. "Wouldn't miss it. Looks like you've outdone yourself this year." Victor laughed modestly, though I knew he had been hoping someone would say exactly that. Then the chairman's eyes shifted to me. "And this is—" Victor didn't hesitate. Not even for half a second. He waved his hand casually toward me. "Oh," he said lightly, "that's just my assistant." He chuckled as if he had made a charming joke. "She's harmless." The chairman laughed politely. Victor didn't look at me again. He had already turned away, guiding Charles deeper into the ballroom toward a table filled with donors and political guests. And just like that, I was standing there, holding his briefcase, reduced to something between staff and decoration. For a moment, I simply watched him walk away. The sound of conversations around me blended together. Laughter, clinking glasses, polite greetings. None of it felt real. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me had finally become very, very still. I had tolerated dismissals before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the scale of the room. Maybe it was the way Victor said it so easily. Or maybe it was because I knew something he didn't. The keynote speaker for the evening had not arrived yet, but he would. And when he did, everything would change. An hour later, the ballroom was full. Hundreds of guests had taken their seats. Journalists lingered near the stage. Camera flashes flickered as Victor moved through the crowd, greeting donors. From across the room, I watched him telling the Aspen story again. I could see the familiar gestures, the confident smile. The moment he mentioned Trevor Walsh's name, several guests leaned closer with interest. Victor loved that moment, loved the impression that he was connected to people with real influence. Eventually, the lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight in support of the Hale Foundation." Applause rippled across the room. Victor stood near the front table, beaming with pride. The host continued. "And now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, an innovator who transformed the technology sector and built one of the most remarkable companies of the last decade." More applause. "Please welcome Trevor Walsh." The doors at the side of the ballroom opened. Trevor walked in calmly, dressed in a simple black suit that somehow looked more expensive than every tuxedo in the room. The applause grew louder. Victor clapped enthusiastically. But I noticed something he didn't. Trevor's eyes were scanning the room, not searching for cameras, not looking for the front table, searching. His gaze moved slowly across the crowd until it reached the back of the ballroom, near the coat check, where I was standing. For a split second, his expression froze. Then recognition hit him. I saw it immediately. The same stunned disbelief I had seen years earlier when he realized his company's first funding round had actually closed. Trevor walked onto the stage. The applause faded. He placed his note cards on the podium, took a breath. "Good evening," he began. His voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man used to speaking in front of thousands. He started delivering his prepared remarks about innovation, resilience, and the importance of bold thinking. Exactly the kind of speech people expected. Victor watched from the front table, smiling proudly. But halfway through the speech, Trevor stopped, mid-sentence. His eyes moved again toward the back of the room, toward me. His hands trembled slightly. The note cards slipped from his fingers and scattered across the stage floor. A murmur spread through the audience. Trevor gripped the podium. "I apologize," he said slowly. The entire room went quiet. Absolute silence. "I was going to talk tonight about the future," Trevor continued. "About innovation. About disruption." He looked directly at me. "But I can't do that." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. "Because someone is here tonight. Someone I never expected to see in public again." Victor frowned slightly from the front table. Trevor's voice grew stronger. 10 years ago, when my company existed only as an idea scribbled on whiteboards, one person believed in it. Guests began turning in their seats. Someone who protected me from investors who would have destroyed the company before it started. Trevor stepped away from the podium. Someone who guided every major decision in my life for a decade, without asking for credit. Victor's smile had completely disappeared now. Trevor lifted his arm and pointed directly toward the back of the ballroom, toward me. "The real architect behind everything I built," his voice echoed through the silent room, "is standing right there." Hundreds of heads turned, all at once. A wave of curiosity and confusion swept across the ballroom, and in the center of it, Victor stood frozen, his wine glass halfway to his lips, his expression slowly shifting from confusion to something much closer to fear. Trevor's voice carried across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he took a breath, "I want you to meet the woman who made my entire career possible." And for the first time that evening, every single person in that ballroom was looking at me. For a few seconds after Trevor Walsh spoke those words, the ballroom seemed to exist inside a strange vacuum of silence. Hundreds of people had turned in their chairs, all of them staring toward the back of the room, toward me. The woman who, only minutes earlier, had been standing quietly beside the coat check, holding her husband's briefcase. The same woman Victor had introduced as his assistant. I could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing across the room like a physical force. But strangely, I didn't feel nervous. I felt calm. Not triumphant, not angry, just calm. Because the truth has a peculiar kind of stillness to it. Trevor stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward the edge of the stage. His eyes never left mine. "Her name," he said, his voice steady now, "is Sophia Rivers." The room erupted, not into applause yet, but into whispers. People leaned toward each other, murmuring urgently. "Did he say Rivers? Is that Victor Hale's wife? I thought she didn't work in tech. Wait, what's happening?" From the front table, I saw Victor slowly lower his wine glass. His face had gone pale. Trevor continued. 12 years ago, I was a broke kid with $27 in my bank account and a terrible business plan. A few people laughed nervously. But Sophia saw something in that idea that no one else did. His voice softened slightly. She invested in me when no venture capital firm would even return my calls. Victor's board members exchanged uneasy glances. Trevor's words kept coming. She helped build the foundation of my company. She protected us from hostile investors, guided our patent strategy, and saved us from mistakes I didn't even know I was making. The whispers in the room grew louder. I could hear fragments drifting through the air. That can't be right. Why didn't anyone know this? Victor never mentioned. Trevor raised his hand slightly. For 10 years, he said, people have called me a visionary. He shook his head slowly. But the truth is, the real strategist behind everything I built chose to remain invisible. Now the room was completely silent again. Trevor looked toward me with unmistakable respect. She never asked for recognition. He paused. Tonight is the first time I've ever spoken about her publicly. That was when the first wave of applause started. Tentative at first, then louder. Several executives near the stage stood up. Soon the entire room was clapping. But the applause wasn't directed at Trevor. It was directed at me. I hadn't moved yet. I was still standing exactly where Victor had left me, holding his briefcase. The irony almost made me smile. Finally, I set the briefcase down and began walking forward. The crowd parted naturally, creating a clear path toward the stage. I noticed something fascinating as I walked. People who had ignored me all evening were now studying me with intense interest, curiosity, respect, even a little awe. The same donors who had been competing for Victor's attention were now whispering among themselves, trying to understand how the quiet woman in the back of the room had just become the most important person there. I reached the front of the ballroom. Trevor stepped down from the stage and met me halfway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. A genuine smile. The kind he used to give me years ago when we met in quiet restaurants to review business plans. "I never thought I'd see you at one of these events," he said softly. "I didn't either," I replied. He glanced briefly toward the front table where Victor was standing, then back at me. "Are you still pretending to be retired?" he asked. I shrugged slightly. "Mostly." Trevor laughed under his breath. Then he turned back toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "This woman changed my life." More applause filled the room, and then the transformation began. It was almost instantaneous. The social gravity in the ballroom shifted. Executives stood up from their tables. Investors approached cautiously. Journalists pulled out their phones and notebooks. I could hear cameras clicking already. Within seconds, a circle of people had formed around Trevor and me. The chairman of Victor's foundation approached first. He was holding a business card with both hands, like an offering. "Ms. Rivers," he said carefully, "I had no idea you were here tonight. If we had known, you would have seated me at the front?" I finished gently. He looked embarrassed. "Yes, well, it's all right," I said. And it was. Because the truth was that none of them had overlooked me by accident. They had simply followed Victor's lead. A reporter from Bloomberg stepped forward next. "Miss Rivers, would you be willing to comment on your role in Trevor Walsh's company?" Another journalist appeared beside him. "Did you intentionally remain anonymous all these years?" More questions followed. Trevor watched quietly beside me, amused. But in the middle of that growing crowd, I noticed someone pushing through the edge of the circle. Victor. His expression was strained. The confident host from earlier had disappeared completely. He stopped a few feet away from us. "Sophia," he said, forcing a smile. His voice sounded slightly breathless. "Can we talk privately for a moment?" The surrounding executives fell silent. Trevor turned toward Victor slowly. The look on Trevor's face was unmistakable. Disdain. Not dramatic, just quiet, unmistakable contempt. Victor shifted uncomfortably under that gaze. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding tonight," Victor continued quickly. "Sophia has always been modest about her background." I looked at him calmly. "You never asked about my background," I said. Victor blinked. Several people around us exchanged glances. "That's not fair," he said quickly. "You never told me about any of this." I tilted my head slightly. "That's true." Victor looked relieved for half a second. Then I finished the sentence. "But you never wanted to know." The silence that followed was heavy. Victor opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time in our entire marriage, he didn't have an answer. Behind him, I could see several donors whispering again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began stepping closer to me instead of him. The room had chosen a new center of gravity. And Victor Hale, the man who had spent years building himself into the star of every room, was suddenly standing on the outside of the circle, watching. The shift in the ballroom that night was not subtle. It was immediate, and it was brutal. For years, Victor had carefully positioned himself as the gravitational center of every gala, every donor dinner, every charity event his foundation hosted. People had orbited him. Politicians, corporate sponsors, journalists, socialites, all of them drawn to the influence he projected. But in less than 10 minutes, that gravitational pull moved, and everyone in the room felt it. Where Victor once stood surrounded by attention, he now stood slightly outside the growing crowd that had formed around Trevor and me. I watched the change happen in real time. It was fascinating in the way social power always is. A venture capitalist approached first, introducing himself with a firm handshake. "Ms. Rivers, I've heard rumors about an anonymous early investor in Walsh Technologies for years," he said carefully. "I never imagined I'd actually meet you." Another executive followed, then a third. A reporter from Bloomberg leaned forward, voice low but eager. "Would you ever consider speaking publicly about your investment strategy? A lot of founders would be very interested in hearing your perspective." Trevor stepped back slightly, allowing the circle to expand. He seemed quietly pleased, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. And somewhere at the edge of that growing crowd stood Victor, still smiling, still trying to maintain the image of a composed host. But the smile was starting to crack. His assistant, Lauren, hovered nervously beside him. I saw her whisper something. Victor nodded sharply and straightened his jacket, as if reminding himself who he was supposed to be tonight. The host, the founder, the man in control. He pushed forward through the crowd again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said loudly, clapping his hands once in an attempt to reclaim the room. "Let's not forget the purpose of tonight's event." His voice carried the polished authority he used during fundraising speeches. "This gala is about the incredible work of the Hale Foundation and the communities we support." Several people turned toward him politely, but they didn't step away from me. Victor continued speaking, forcing warmth into his voice. "We're all honored to have Trevor Walsh here tonight, of course. His insights into leadership and innovation are truly inspiring." Trevor raised an eyebrow slightly. Victor's gaze flicked briefly toward me before returning to the room. And I'm sure Sophia appreciates the kind words Trevor shared. She's always been a very supportive partner. Supportive. The word hung in the air like a thin veil. The implication was clear. He was trying to minimize what had just happened, trying to reshape the narrative before it fully escaped his control. Trevor didn't let that happen. He stepped forward calmly. "I think we may have different definitions of supportive, Victor," he said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Victor forced a laugh. "Trevor, you know how stories get exaggerated at events like this." "No," Trevor replied evenly. "Actually, I don't." He turned slightly toward the crowd. "Sophia didn't support my company. She built the strategic framework that allowed it to survive its first 5 years." Several investors nodded. They understood exactly how significant that statement was. Trevor continued. "She restructured my capital table before our Series A funding, negotiated our first patent protections, and quietly stopped 2 acquisition attempts that would have dismantled the company before it went public." Now the journalists were writing quickly. Victor's face tightened. "I wasn't aware my wife had such extensive involvement in Trevor's business," he said stiffly. Trevor looked directly at him. "Because you never asked." A murmur passed through the room again. Victor's assistant looked like she wanted to disappear. One of the foundation's major donors, an older woman who had spent the entire evening praising Victor's leadership, leaned toward another guest and whispered something behind her hand. Victor noticed, and panic flickered behind his eyes for the first time. He tried one more time. "Well," he said, clapping his hands lightly again, "this is certainly a wonderful surprise. Sophia has always been very private about her past work." I finally spoke again. "Private," I said quietly, "is not the same thing as invisible." Victor looked at me sharply. That sentence had landed exactly where it needed to. Around us, the room was alive with quiet conversations now. Executives were pulling out their phones. Journalists were already sending quick messages to editors. Even members of Victor's own board had begun whispering among themselves. I caught fragments of those conversations drifting through the air. She advised Walsh Technologies? Why didn't Victor ever mention this? If she's that connected, why has she been treated like staff? The answer to those questions was simple. Victor had built his public identity around being the most impressive person in the room. Acknowledging me would have complicated that, maybe even threatened it. And now the room was starting to see the gap between the image he had constructed and the reality standing in front of them. The chairman of the foundation approached again, but this time he didn't speak to Victor. He spoke directly to me. "Ms. Rivers," he said carefully, Would you consider joining the Foundation's advisory board? Your experience could be extremely valuable. Victor's head snapped toward him. That won't be necessary, Victor said quickly. Sophia prefers to keep her life quiet. The chairman hesitated, then looked back at me. Is that true? I met his eyes calmly. No. Another ripple moved through the room. Victor's control was slipping now. I could see it in the way his shoulders tightened, the way he glanced around as if searching for allies. But the allies he expected weren't there anymore. People were watching him differently now. Not with admiration, with curiosity and suspicion. Because once someone's carefully constructed image cracks in public, people begin looking for the fractures underneath. Trevor leaned closer to me and spoke quietly. You know this is only the beginning, right? I know, I said. Victor stood just a few feet away from us, still smiling, still trying to pretend the night hadn't turned against him. But the truth had already begun spreading through the ballroom like a slow, unstoppable shockwave. And before the evening ended, it would reach far beyond that room. By the time the gala finally ended that night, the ballroom looked very different from the polished scene Victor had imagined months earlier. The tables were half empty. Clusters of guests lingered in quiet conversations, but the energy in the room had shifted from celebration to something far more uncomfortable. Exposure. Victor stood near the bar, speaking with two board members, his posture stiff and overly formal. Every few minutes he forced a laugh, the sound too sharp and too loud for the small group around him. I had seen that version of him before. It was the version that appeared whenever control began slipping from his hands. Across the room, Trevor was finishing a conversation with a pair of investors when he glanced toward me. You okay? He asked softly when he walked over. I nodded. I will be. He studied my face for a moment. You're handling this better than most people would. I've had practice, I said quietly. That was the truth. When you spend years learning how to disappear in a room, you also learn how to watch people very carefully. And that night, I was watching the life Victor had built begin to unravel piece by piece. Several of his biggest donors had already left early. Not abruptly, but noticeably. Their conversations with Victor had been brief and awkward. One of the board members had pulled him aside near the stage earlier. The discussion looked tense, their voices low, but their expressions serious. Victor had tried to laugh it off afterward, but I could see the unease spreading. People were beginning to ask questions. And questions are dangerous things when your reputation depends on a carefully maintained narrative. Trevor checked his watch. I'm heading to a late dinner with a few investors, he said. You should come. I shook my head. Not tonight. He nodded, understanding immediately. Some things needed quiet. Call me tomorrow, he said. We have a lot to talk about. I know. Trevor gave my shoulder a brief, respectful squeeze before leaving. I watched him disappear through the ballroom doors, surrounded by people eager for his attention. For the first time all evening, I was alone. And strangely, that was when the weight of everything finally settled over me. Not the public moment. Not the applause. Not even Victor's humiliation. The weight came from something deeper. 3.5 years of marriage. 3.5 years of slowly shrinking myself inside someone else's idea of who I should be. And suddenly that version of my life had collapsed. Not gradually. All at once. Victor approached me about 10 minutes later. The room had thinned out enough now that there was no crowd between us. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His expression was tight, controlled, but his eyes carried something else. Fear. Sophia, he said finally, lowering his voice. What exactly was that tonight? I looked at him. What do you mean? You know what I mean. His jaw flexed. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. The words hung in the air. For a second, I almost laughed. You introduced me as your assistant, I said calmly. Victor rubbed his temple. That was a joke. No, I replied. It wasn't. His frustration began surfacing now. You could have told me about Trevor years ago. You could have asked. That's not the point, isn't it? Victor exhaled sharply and paced a few steps across the marble floor. You've made things complicated for me tonight. That sentence revealed everything. Not we. Not us. Me. Complicated for me. Victor turned back toward me. You have no idea how delicate these relationships are, he said. Donors expect consistency, They expect stability. You mean they expect the version of you they've been sold? His eyes hardened. That's unfair, is it? For a moment, he looked like he might argue. Then something in his expression shifted. The anger softened into something else. Something almost pleading. Sophia, he said quietly, why didn't you trust me with this part of your life? The question might have sounded sincere to someone who didn't know him, but I did. It wasn't curiosity. It was damage control. I did trust you, I said. Victor frowned. When? Every time you told a room full of strangers that I didn't matter. He stared at me. You're twisting things. No, I said softly. I'm finally saying them out loud. Victor opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Because in that moment, he realized something. The silence he had relied on for years was gone. The woman who stood quietly beside coat checks and carried his briefcase no longer existed. And without that silence, the entire structure of our marriage looked very different. We left the ballroom together that night in complete silence. The drive home was just as quiet. The city lights blurred across the car windows while Victor gripped the steering wheel tightly. Neither of us spoke, because deep down, we both understood something neither of us had the words for yet. That night hadn't just exposed Victor to the world. It had exposed the truth about our marriage. And that truth was far harder to fix than any public embarrassment. By the time the front door closed behind him with a quiet, final sound, I remained outside for a moment longer. The night air was cool, still, peaceful, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like something I was trapped inside. It felt like something I could finally walk out of. The morning after the gala felt strangely quiet, not peaceful, just heavy. The house Victor and I shared had always been large, with tall windows and wide hallways that echoed slightly when you walked through them. Usually, Victor filled that space with constant phone calls, meetings, or plans for his next event. But that morning, there was only silence. I woke early and walked into the kitchen. Victor was already there, standing by the counter with his phone pressed against his ear. His voice was tight. No, that's not what happened, he said quickly. Trevor exaggerated things. Yes, Sophia knows him, but... He stopped when he noticed me in the doorway. The person on the other end of the call must have said something unpleasant. Victor's expression hardened. We'll discuss it later, he said before hanging up. He placed the phone on the counter and rubbed his face. For the first time in years, Victor looked tired, not socially exhausted, genuinely tired. You're up early, he said. So are you. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat down. 3 board members called me this morning, he said. I poured coffee quietly and sat across from him. They want explanations. That makes sense. Victor frowned. You don't understand how foundations operate, he said. Perception matters. I met his gaze calmly. Yes, I said. It does. That sentence seemed to irritate him. This situation has created unnecessary confusion. Because people learned the truth? Victor leaned forward. Because they think I misrepresented things. I didn't answer. We both knew the word he avoided. Lying. Victor stared at the table for a moment, then asked quietly, why didn't you tell me about Trevor? It was the same question he asked the night before. But this time, his voice carried less anger, more desperation. I took a sip of coffee before answering. Because every time I tried to talk about my past, you dismissed it. That's not true. Victor. I waited until he looked at me again. You once told a room full of investors that I read a lot when someone asked about my work. His face flushed slightly. That was a joke. You say that about a lot of things. Victor leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. You're acting like I intentionally insulted you. You did. The simplicity of the sentence left him with nothing to argue. Victor's phone buzzed again on the table. He picked it up, then froze. What? I asked. He turned the screen toward me. It was a news headline. Mystery tech investor revealed at charity gala. Sophia Rivers identified as early architect of Walsh Technologies. Another headline appeared beneath it. Questions surround Hale Foundation after gala revelation. Victor's jaw tightened. They're twisting this, he muttered. I looked at the article. The journalist had already pieced together several details about Trevor's early investors, and my name was now attached to those stories. Not as a rumor, as confirmation. Victor scrolled further. The article mentioned something else. Several donors were reviewing their relationship with the Hale Foundation. Victor set the phone down slowly. "This is bad," he said quietly. I watched him carefully. Victor had spent years believing he controlled the narrative around his life. Now that narrative had slipped out of his hands, and he didn't know how to get it back. "I need to speak with the board," he said. "You probably do." Victor stood up and paced across the kitchen. "They think I misled them about my connections." "Didn't you?" "That's not the point." He stopped and looked at me again. "You could help fix this." "How?" Victor hesitated. "If you publicly clarify that Trevor exaggerated your role, it would calm things down." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. "You want me to lie?" "I want you to help stabilize the situation." "That's the same thing." Victor sighed. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be." I stared at him, and suddenly something inside me clicked. A realization so clear it almost felt physical. Victor still didn't understand, even after everything that happened the night before. He believed I would continue shrinking myself to protect him. "You're asking me to erase my own work," I said slowly. "I'm asking you to protect our life." "Our life?" I repeated. Victor nodded. "Yes." I set my coffee cup down. "That life only worked because you believed I was smaller than you." His expression hardened again. "You're twisting everything." "No," I said calmly. "I'm finally seeing it clearly." Victor looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're overreacting." And in that moment, I realized something very important. Victor wasn't going to change. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to. To him, the problem wasn't the years of disrespect. The problem was that the world had noticed. My phone buzzed on the table. I picked it up. A message from Trevor. "Dinner tonight. Important." I typed back. "All right," Victor noticed. "You're meeting him again?" "Yes." His tone sharpened. "This situation is already out of control, Sophia." I stood up. "No," I said quietly. "It's finally honest." Victor watched me walk toward the door. "Sophia," he said, his voice tight. "If you walk out right now, you're making things worse." I paused for a moment, then looked back at him. "No," I said. "I'm just refusing to pretend anymore." And for the first time since we met, I walked away from Victor without asking permission. The consequences of that gala did not explode all at once. They spread slowly, like cracks in glass. At first, Victor tried to convince himself everything could still be controlled. For the first 2 days after the event, he moved through the house like a man trying to repair invisible damage. Phone calls started before sunrise. Emails were drafted and redrafted. Statements were prepared for board members, donors, and journalists. Victor's strategy was simple. Reframe the story. Minimize the revelation. Control the narrative before it became something else. But the problem with truth, once it escapes, is that it moves faster than reputation. By the end of the week, 3 major donors had requested clarification meetings with the Hale Foundation's board. 2 corporate sponsors quietly postponed their funding commitments for the following year, and the press had discovered something even more interesting than the gala itself. They began looking into the foundation's finances. At first, the articles were cautious, small paragraphs buried beneath headlines about my connection to Trevor Walsh. But journalists are patient hunters. Once they sense weakness, they keep digging. Within 10 days, questions about Victor's leadership had become louder. Board members began holding private discussions without him. One afternoon, while Victor was pacing in his office on another phone call, his assistant Lauren arrived at the house unexpectedly. She looked pale. "Victor," she said quietly, standing in the doorway. "The board has scheduled an emergency meeting tonight." Victor stopped pacing. "For what?" "They said it's an internal review." Victor frowned. "That's ridiculous." Lauren hesitated. "They didn't invite you." For a moment, the room went completely silent. Victor stared at her as if he had misheard. "I founded that organization," he said slowly. Lauren nodded uneasily. "I know." Victor dismissed her quickly after that. But the moment she left, the confident tone he had been performing all week finally cracked. He sank into the chair behind his desk and rubbed his face. "They can't do this," he muttered. I was standing in the doorway watching him. "They can," I said gently. Victor looked up sharply. "This is happening because of you." The accusation hung in the air, but it didn't land the way he expected. "No," I said calmly. "This is happening because people started asking questions." Victor stood up again. "You humiliated me in front of every donor in that room." "I told the truth." "You embarrassed the foundation." "I didn't steal from it." The words slipped out before I had time to soften them. Victor froze. "What did you just say?" I held his gaze. "You heard me." Because by then, the articles had already begun appearing. Not just about the gala. About financial discrepancies. About payments made to consulting firms that seemed difficult to trace. About unusual expenses tied to events that never actually took place. Victor's expression hardened. "Those are accounting misunderstandings." "Are they?" He walked toward me slowly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough." Victor stopped a few feet away. For a moment, his anger looked almost desperate. "You could have helped me avoid this," he said. The sentence sounded strange now, like the echo of a belief he still hadn't fully let go of, that I existed to support him, that I would protect him, even from himself. But that version of me was gone. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation collapsed quickly. The board suspended Victor from his role as executive director. A formal investigation began, reviewing the foundation's finances. Several journalists published detailed reports about questionable expenditures. Money that donors believed had funded charity programs had instead been used for luxury events, private travel, and consulting firms tied to Victor's family connections. Victor insisted it was all a misunderstanding, but evidence has a way of speaking clearly when people start listening. Meanwhile, my own life moved in a very different direction. Trevor and I met frequently to discuss the advisory position he had offered. The legal documents he prepared transferred significant voting rights in several of his companies to me. Not ceremonial roles, real influence. For the first time in years, I began participating openly in the technology world again. And the response surprised me. Founders who had quietly worked with me in the past reached out. Investors who remembered my early projects contacted Trevor's team asking for introductions. Within a month, I was attending private industry gatherings again, not as someone's wife, not as background decoration, but as myself. Victor, however, continued unraveling. His phone rarely stopped ringing. Lawyers, former board members, journalists requesting comment. The house grew tense and silent. Some nights he paced the hallways long after midnight. Other nights he drank alone in the living room while refreshing news websites. Every new article seemed to make the situation worse. One evening I came downstairs and found him sitting at the dining table, surrounded by papers. He looked exhausted. "They're opening a federal investigation," he said quietly. I sat across from him. Victor stared at the documents in front of him. "They think I misused charitable funds." I didn't respond, because the truth was already clear. Victor had built his reputation on appearances. And when appearances collapse, everything built on top of them collapses too. 3 weeks after the gala, I received a text message from him while I was attending a small investor dinner with Trevor. "Please call me." I read it, then set the phone back down. Trevor glanced at the screen. "You going to respond?" I shook my head. "No." He nodded slowly, because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's simply the end of a conversation. 6 weeks after the gala, the marriage between Victor Hale and me ended quietly in a courthouse hallway. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting, no audience. Just two people standing across from each other beneath fluorescent lights, while a clerk called names for the next hearing. Victor looked very different from the man who had stood confidently in the grand metropolitan ballroom that night. The tailored suits were still there, but the confidence had drained out of them. His foundation had already suspended him indefinitely. The board had removed his access to the organization's accounts and communication systems. His name had quietly disappeared from the foundation's website, while investigators reviewed years of financial records. More damaging still, federal prosecutors had opened a formal case involving misuse of charitable funds. Victor had spent weeks insisting everything was a misunderstanding, but the evidence had grown louder, and the people who once surrounded him had grown quieter. By the time we stood in that courthouse hallway, The world he built out of admiration and careful storytelling had almost completely collapsed. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I still don't understand something," he said. "What?" "Why you never told me who you really were." The question sounded almost sincere, but the answer had become very simple. "You never wanted to know," I said. Victor frowned slightly. "That's not true." "It is." I held his gaze. "Every time someone asked about my past, you turned it into a joke. Every time I spoke about work, you changed the subject. You didn't want a partner, Victor." He looked away. "You wanted someone smaller than you." The words stayed in the air between us. Not angry, just honest. Victor exhaled slowly. "You could have helped me build something bigger," he said. I almost smiled. "That's the tragedy," I replied. "We might have." The court clerk called our names, and just like that, the conversation ended. The divorce was finalized quickly. With his accounts frozen during the federal investigation and legal fees mounting, Victor had little leverage left to prolong the process. Our marriage ended the same way it had quietly existed for years, without spectacle. Meanwhile, the rest of my life moved forward in ways that felt strangely peaceful. Trevor's company completed its long-planned public offering 2 months later. For the first time in years, my name appeared in official documents again, not as a rumor, not as a hidden advisor, but as one of the founding strategic advisors behind the company's early development. Seeing it printed there felt unusual, but also right. I returned to working with several technology founders, offering guidance the same way I always had, quietly, carefully, without needing attention. The lake house I had bought years earlier became my favorite place again. Afternoons there were simple: reading, thinking, occasionally taking calls with entrepreneurs halfway across the world. The silence felt different now, not like something forced on me, like something I had chosen. Victor's story, however, moved in a very different direction. Investigators eventually confirmed what many people had begun suspecting. Funds donated for charitable programs had been redirected to personal expenses and consulting firms connected to Victor's family. He eventually pleaded guilty to fraud and embezzlement charges related to the foundation. The court sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. The judge noted that misusing money intended for charitable causes made the crime especially serious. The foundation itself was dissolved soon afterward. Remaining funds were redirected to legitimate charities under court supervision. I never attended the hearings. I never gave interviews. And I never contacted reporters. Revenge was never part of my plan. All I did was stop hiding. Sometimes that's enough. The last message Victor ever sent me arrived several weeks before the sentencing. Just one line. "I never knew who you really were." I looked at it for a long time. Then I typed 4 words. "You never wanted to." That was the truth of our entire marriage. Victor didn't overlook me because I was quiet. He overlooked me because it made him feel larger. He needed someone who could carry his briefcase at charity galas while he played the role of visionary philanthropist. He needed someone smaller so he could feel important. But the moment the world saw me clearly, that illusion couldn't survive, and neither could our marriage. There's a lesson in that. Not about revenge, not about humiliation. Real justice rarely arrives with dramatic speeches or carefully planned payback. Sometimes justice is much simpler. Sometimes it's just the moment when you stop pretending to be less than you are, because the truth has a way of standing up on its own. And once it does, anyone who built their life on ignoring it will eventually have to face what they refused to see.